Okay, I know we still have a few people coming in, but I'd like to get started. I'm Dan Snyder. I'm the Associate Director for Research here at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and welcome to, I think, this very special panel discussion on uncovering North Korea. And this panel is part of a full day of events to honor the 2012 recipient of the Shorenstein Journalism Award for coverage of Asia, and our recipient this year, whom you'll hear shortly, is Barbara Demick, who's a wonderful correspondent. She's the Los Angeles Times bureau chief in Beijing, and before that spent many years in Korea. And in many ways, this panel, both the award, but in some sense, this panel is inspired by her work in covering North Korea. As someone who, in my previous life, was a journalist and also have tried to cover North Korea over a long period of time, I think it's pretty easy to say that there's probably no more difficult country to cover as a journalist than North Korea. Not only because the access is extremely limited, but because I think the North Koreans work very hard at making it difficult to understand what's going on, and have created a rather powerful set of narratives about themselves, which they relentlessly put forward. And so trying to make your way through that is a really daunting task. And so this panel was assembled really with the idea of looking at the challenge of covering North Korea from different perspectives. And I'll sort of go through it in the order in which people are going to be speaking. The first perspective, naturally, is that of the journalist, the reporter on the ground, and that Barbara will talk about. And her book, Nothing to Envy, Ordinary Lives in North Korea, which was based upon a series of articles that she did for the Los Angeles Times, really represents, in my view, I think the sort of model, the paradigm for how to cover North Korea. Because with very limited access, the challenge is how do you get a sense of really surety and verisimilitude about covering North Korea. And she did it through, I think, a really unique method, and I think she'll talk about that somewhat today, of not just interviewing refugees from North Korea, which I think many people have done, but in focusing on one particular locale in North Korea and assembling stories from people who were from that area over a long period of time through lots of research, and being able to draw an incredibly detailed and rich portrait of life in North Korea as a result. And I think it, as I said, I think it's something that other people maybe have tried to do, but none succeeded in the way that Barbara did. And the result is, I think, the kinds of insights that are really hard to come by. The second speaker is Susan Chira, the assistant managing editor for news for the New York Times, whom I've known for a long period of time. And we were correspondents together in Tokyo many moons ago when she also faced the challenge of covering Korea. And her perspective is not only that, not so much as her experience as a reporter, but her experience as an editor. She was the foreign editor of the New York Times for 8 years, and she now supervises all the foreign and national news coverage of the New York Times. And she's going to offer you the perspective that she has had in having reporters tasked to her to cover North Korea, and I think it'll give you kind of a slightly different view of this job. The third person, I think, offers in some ways a very interesting and unique perspective, and that's the perspective of a novelist. And this is Adam Johnson, who is an associate professor of English with an emphasis on creative writing here at Stanford University. And he wrote, I think, a really amazing novel called The Orphan Master's Son, widely praised and rightfully so, about really the central character is a North Korean man who goes through many different changes in his life and in a way takes you through the entirety of what's been going on in contemporary North Korea over the last period of time. And I'd like just to read one comment made by David Ignatius in his review of the book in the Washington Post, in which he said, well, that this book, he said, was an instructive lesson in how to paint a fictional world against a background of fact. He said, the secret is research. Johnson spent 6 years working on The Orphan Master's Son, reading everything he could about North Korea, ingesting the oral histories of defectors, and eventually visiting the country. He said, it is this process of reimagination that makes the fictional locale so real and gives the novel an impact you could never achieve with 1,000 newspaper stories. I'm not sure I'd agree with that last point, but I absolutely think it's true. And I think so. His perspective as a writer, I think, is also important because it's a writer who delved deeply into using, actually, the reporting of others on North Korea to construct the world that he did in his novel. And last but not least, is our current Pantech fellow, who in some sense I sort of thought of as if we had the journalist and the editor and the novelist, we have the source, if you will. The kind of person that journalists love to find, and when they can find them, they exploit them to the maximum. And I believe that relationship has existed a little bit between Barbara and Kati Zellweger, who has been traveling in and out of North Korea since the mid-1950s as a development and aid worker, and spent 5 years before coming here to Stanford, 5 years running the Swiss government's aid and development office in Pyongyang. And she really has, I've met a lot of people who've worked in North Korea and gone in and out of North Korea. I've never met anyone who comes close to Kati's real on-the-ground knowledge and understanding of life in North Korea. And therefore, she's an invaluable person for journalists to get to know. But it's also interesting, I hope, to get her perspective. When she looks at the coverage of North Korea, what does she see? Does she see accuracy? Does she see insight? Or does she see distortion and lack of understanding? So that's sort of the panoply of views that you're going to get at this panel. And I'll stop right there and let it proceed. And as usual, we'll try and leave as much time as possible for questions and answers at the end. And I'll ask you, when you do ask a question, for the benefit of the speakers, to identify yourselves. Thank you. So, with no further ado, Barbara Demick.
Thank you very much. So I should tell you a little bit about my work with North Korea. In many ways, as Dan said, North Korea is a very difficult place to cover, and because of the lack of access. In my case, to the contrary, it was the lack of access, I think, that inspired me. I think all of you know some journalists, and we're very contrarian creatures. And I became, I would say, fairly obsessed with North Korea in 2001, in large part because I was not able to get in. I was sent in 2001 to be the Korea correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, based in Seoul, but my job description was to cover the entire Korean peninsula. And this was shortly before President Bush's Axis of Evil speech. And I, as a US citizen, a journalist, somebody living in Seoul with a smattering of Korean language, was about as persona non grata as you could get. There was no way I could get into Pyongyang in that period. And it bred in me this craziness. Journalists are like the cat with the string. If you give them the string, they're not interested. I think if I could have gotten into North Korea in that period, I would have thought, cold, difficult place, crummy food, who wants to go? But because I could not go, I became obsessed. And my I made it my mission in living in Korea to interview as many North Korean defectors as I possibly could, to try to get them fresh before they got their ideas from newspapers and the web and secondhand. And I really felt that if I could not get into North Korea, I should be able to get into the mindset of the people. And I think this has been true of what I've tried to do as a journalist my whole career as a foreign correspondent. You're trying to really understand how people tick, getting readers to empathize with them. Not always easy. North Koreans, this is something that people don't get when you say it's the hardest place in the world to cover. North Koreans love to talk. They're really very chatty. And over the years, I've interviewed North Korean defectors in various parts of South Korea. I interview them now, because I'm based in Beijing, quite often in China. Actually, the people I interview in China at the border are not even defectors. There's a lot of people now who come in as, well, they're illegal border crossers, but they're essentially guest workers. They come to make money and they go back. And it's the funniest thing, because of all the people I've interviewed over the years, because I've worked throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans and in the Middle East and Korea, Japan, South Korea, Japan, China. North Koreans are like the chattiest. And it's always very funny, especially working at the Chinese border, when you meet a North Korean the first time. They've invariably never met a Caucasian and never an American. And they immediately are like, 미국놈, 미국놈. That means like American bastard. They don't like Americans. It's like the opposite of the honorific. And they're like, they're very nervous. 무서워요. And then after about 5 minutes, they start talking. And I think, something that I've been very successful with is, maybe because I'm from New York and I'm Jewish, I'm used to shrinks. And so, they really need to shrink, these North Koreans. And if you listen to them, they will pour it out, men and women. And, I've interviewed North Koreans for hours and hours and hours and heard them cry and talk about their love life. And they are amazing people to interview. They're some of the easiest people to interview I've ever met. And I think it's because they have so few opportunities to express themselves. And it's always an amazing experience. And I have to explain again and again, no, I'm not a missionary. No, they always say, what church are you? What church are you? No, I'm not a church. Do you work for the government? No, I'm a journalist. But they really want to tell their stories, and they've had very, very tough lives. And the people, always cry. They always cry when they talk about just the ordinary things that have happened to them. North Koreans, most of them outside of Pyongyang, live in a perpetual state of semi-starvation. I say semi-starvation because they really have not had a famine since the 90s, but their diet is so poor and so continually poor over the years, 20 years now. They've not been able to eat properly. Most people do not know where their dinner is coming from. If you talk to them, they would say, I get up in the morning and I worry about what I'm going to eat for dinner. They are always worried that their parents are on the verge of starvation. They're always worried that their children are small. And I'm talking about often people who are quite loyal to the regime. Increasingly, the North Koreans coming out into China are well-connected. Many of them are party members. I would say the profile defector nowadays is a woman in her 50s who, if she's not a party member, her husband is a party member. Probably she was, I'm going right into it because I think this is a very educated audience. Often they're people who've worked at the markets and have not been able to make a living because of the restrictions on market activity in North Korea. They, they sort of apologize. They say, oh, I'm sorry to say this about my country, but their lives are very, very tough. I will say there has been more hopefulness since Kim Jong-il died. My sense of North Koreans is, people will say I'm wrong, is that people did not like Kim Jong-il. They didn't want to admit it, but if you scratch a little, I find it hard to believe that they did. Most of the people I've met really loved Kim Il-sung, and even some of the hard-bitten defectors say it was all a lie, blah, 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 but a lot of them really loved Kim Il-sung. They blame Kim Jong-il for the famine. Kim Il-sung did one thing very smart, which is that he died at exactly the right time, 1994, just as things were going down the tube. Kim Jong-il also did something, stupid, which is he died, maybe at the wrong time for him, the right time for his son. I think that things are on their way up in North Korea, and I don't think collapse is as inevitable as I did a few years ago, because the Chinese obviously don't want North Korea to collapse. The Chinese are supporting North Korea. The Chinese model of state-controlled capitalism with Chinese characteristics, has proven more successful than anybody would have expected. And Kim Jong-un is quite popular. This is what surprised me. I was in Dandong on the Korean border in October, and the North Koreans I met there, and they were not defectors, they were all going back. Well, one wasn't going back, but they were pretty positive about him. Oh, he looks like his grandfather, he's young, he's techie, blah, blah, blah. His wife is beautiful, she has designer clothes. This is kind of a ridiculous reason. But he is kind of starting fresh. And because he has not been in power that long, he's not somebody who's going to be hauled in front of a tribunal for crimes against humanity yet. He's not responsible for the famine of the 90s. He's not responsible, well, maybe he's responsible for some of the attacks on South Korea. But he still is coming in, with a clean slate. And I thought that he has a tremendous opportunity to open things up in a way that his father couldn't. I don't think Kim Jong-il could ever open things up because basically he's a criminal. He's responsible for millions of famine deaths. There's no other way around it. But Kim Jong-un is clean. It will be very interesting if he blows the opportunity, which I think he will if he does the nuclear test. That's a big if. But I'm really curious about which way it will go. As I said, I think there's a great opportunity right now. The Chinese are willing to invest in a big way. There's a lot of money coming in from the Middle East. You have a new president in South Korea. Park Geun-hye has, said she will restore some of the relations that were severed when Lee Myung-bak took over. There's, certainly Kathy can tell you more about this, not to reveal my sources ever, but I think there's, much more hopefulness in Pyongyang. There's certainly, more light. Okay, there's Dolphinarium and, some new restaurants and a new airport terminal. But, I would say since Kim Jong-il's death, it's the first time I've seen, sort of a path for them, a path where they can go forward. I don't know if they're going to take it. The nuclear test looks like it would put them right back where they were before. I'm not certain that they're going to do a nuclear test. I believe, talking to people in Beijing, that the Chinese have leaned very heavily on them the last few weeks there have been editorials in the state press saying North Korea should expect assistance to be reduced if they do the nuclear test. I think there might have been a phone call. The Chinese are, quite fixated at the moment on waging, is it a war or whatever they're doing with Japan? But I mean, the Chinese see their confrontation with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands as the #1 foreign policy priority at the moment, and a North Korean nuclear test is not convenient for them. It's bufangyan, not good timing. And I believe personally that they've leaned very heavily on the North Koreans, but I don't know. That's it. That's everything I know at the moment.
So I'm talking from the position of an editor whose responsibility it is to try to direct coverage and help strategize with correspondents about how to fulfill our responsibility to try to glean whatever crumbs there are of knowledge and write about them in a way that reveals how flawed our sources of information are inevitably and why we have some sense that what we're writing is credible. And that's really a big struggle, both as a correspondent and as an editor. And I want to share with you some of the ways in which we at the Times, and I in my time as foreign editor, tried to take on this challenge. I heartily agree with Dan's assessment that Barbara is the single best reporter who has covered North Korea that I have seen, and I unashamedly stole from her reporting techniques. I read her book, which is a remarkable piece of reporting, which is also highly readable and desperately sad and gripping. And I will just share one anecdote and then I'll talk more generally, but I was so taken by her inventiveness because the struggle has always been, just to back up for a moment, that when you interview defectors, there's obviously all kinds of questions about credibility. Are they exaggerating to win some place in society? Are they distorting, for example, Barbara mentioned the church. One of the most active forces has been missionaries and church groups who have their own, shall we say, agenda, which emphasizes lack of religious freedom, which may indeed not be as prominent in the accounts of defectors' suffering as the church groups would like them to say. So I have a healthy dose of cynicism, although I also recognize the heroic work of a lot of church and missionary groups in terms of human rights. But you have to really watch out because defectors obviously have an advantage in emphasizing the negative or in being bound by others' agendas. And certainly, if you're based in South Korea or Tokyo or Beijing, you try to do what you can with academic work, you try to do what you can with scholars, but, and forgive me in this heart of academic learning, but scholars also have perspectives and agendas that you need to filter as you report, particularly, say, in South Korea. You're not always sure. There's a tendency to continually portray the country on the brink of collapse for their own geopolitical reasons and perspectives. So you're constantly dealing with sources whose veracity and credibility you have to figure out how to feel comfortable with, or at least reveal its constraints. And people like Kate, who have actually firsthand knowledge of North Korea, are quite rare. We try to find them, but there's not a huge number of people. There are diplomats also who you try to speak with. But so when I saw what Barbara had done, which was pick one city in Korea and then interview as many people from that city so that she could effectively cross-check their accounts and piece together a Google mapping to try to understand the geography and the history, I thought that was a really brilliant idea to kind of overlap stories, much as anthropologists and others do in trying to understand the credibility of the people they study. So I actually asked our Beijing correspondent, Sharon Lafreniere, who's a colleague of Barbara's, I said, I've been very inspired by this book. And this was some time after its publication, and the news event we were trying to understand was in November '09, when there was a sudden devaluation of the currency, and we wanted to try to understand, in the waning days of Kim Jong-il, what we could learn about daily life. So Sharon took this on and spent several months trying to go to the Chinese border, as Barbara described, and find people fairly fresh. And I think she ended up having to find some of them not on the border, but also in other holding areas where they were being assisted on their escape, but trying to overlay stories so she could cross-check, and did a piece, a pale shadow certainly of Barbara's work was a very compelling look. It was published in June 2010, of the devastation that this currency devaluation wrought, even on loyal party members whose savings were wiped out in a moment, who, had ended up spending hundreds of times more on food than they might have but a few days previously. And it was really quite heartrending, as Barbara described, the emotion that people showed and that we were able to pick together. But it's very, very difficult. And I thought I would talk a little bit about some of the ways that the reporters I know try to piece together. Compared to my days, there are a couple of other sources too, in addition to defectors that we work with. The advent, as Barbara mentioned, of the increased sort of border activity between China and North Korea means that you can get people coming back and forth. They're trading, they're guest workers, they're going out to try to get some goods, which they can turn for a small profit, and so you try to ensconce yourselves there and see who you can find. But some of these people also have been given cell phones, and while this is not a very large number of North Koreans, and it's geographically limited to people who can kind of get in and out of the border, there have been ability to have cell phone conversations, and there have been some publications that have sprung up that journalists will be familiar with, such as Good Times, and I think it's called Korean Daily, although I have to check my name because I don't directly supervise anymore. Yeah, Daily NK, thanks, Daily NK. And so you try to look at those sources too, again with a grain of salt, because you know that people may want to be paid for tips. So we, the New York Times, and I know Barbara too, we will not pay. Our reporters have often been asked for money, and we can't engage in that kind of transaction. But there is some payment that sometimes goes on, so you have to filter that through and understand what to do. Obviously, one of the great tasks for us since Barbara's book was published is to try to understand, as Barbara brought out, what the transition to Kim Jong-un has meant. And the correspondent we rely on, in addition to our folks in China, but most heavily, is our correspondent based in Seoul, whose name is Chae Sung-hun, who is South Korean, but who has tried very hard to filter what he can. And it's interesting hearing Barbara's perspective, because initially we did see a burst of hopefulness, and the idea that Kim Jong-un made an appearance and his wife was there and she was pregnant and she had a pretty dress on, and what did this mean, and was he going to allow changes, and would he be more modern, and would he not be shackled by the past? The jury is still out. Our correspondent is a little bit more skeptical now, having seen some of the acts of provocation that the new leader may be authorizing or may feel the need to allow to happen to solidify his base among the military. All of this is complete guesswork, very frankly, and we have to label it as such. But, I'm interested in Barbara's perspective that perhaps he is hesitant on the nuclear test because a lot of us have been sort of bracing to be woken up by the fact that this test, had just taken place. We kept expecting it. So it may be the Chinese are bringing pressure to bear. It may be that there is some reluctance, or it may happen in a blink of an eye, tonight. But I think as an editor, what we struggle to do is, in a place in which we have, when we get access, which occasionally we do, it's terribly constrained. You have minders, and you're piecing it together. And I told the story of this assignment to my colleague in Beijing, because I think what editors try to do is to be as creative as we can to figure out how to go beyond the kind of navel-gazing and interim reports that are inevitably part of the coverage, but is an enormous challenge. And I always feel as an editor, what you do have to do is, your responsibility is to write in the caveats as clearly as possible so that readers understand that you are dealing to a much greater degree than other articles we publish with highly fragmented information. And I think I'll stop there to allow other perspectives.
Don't fall off the stage.
Hello, can people hear me? Hi, I'm Adam Johnson. I'm the English teacher on the panel. And it's always an honor to be in a room with all the North Korea experts, people who've dedicated their lives to studying this kind of fascinating, unique, interesting, very human, and in many ways very tragic place right now. And I always feel like I learn so much when I get to hang out with the cool North Korea people. And I'm with the coolest today. I was asked to speak about, as a fiction writer, how did I approach this topic? How did I uncover? How did I come to see what I came to believe is some of the human truths of that place? And of course, the big question is, who am I, or who are any of us, really, to write about this place on the other side of the world? And, I'm not Korean. I don't speak Korean. If I'd have known I was going to spend years writing about North Korea, the first thing I would have done is learn Korean. It's a beautiful language. But why make up a story about a real place is a real question. And who was I to do it? So I'll just say that, I teach a novel class here at Stanford, and I always throw in a memoir so we can look at how real people write about their own lives. It's okay. As we, as writers, try to figure out how to fake real lives, to kind of keep our gauges accurate. And in 2003, I think I picked a book I hadn't read. It was Kang Chol-won's The Aquariums of Pyongyang, which I thought was probably a pretty amazing memoir, and it did turn out to be quite an extraordinary story. One thing we noticed as a class right away was that Kang needed help writing his story. He had to write it with someone else. Barbara spoke about how North Koreans are very chatty. I see also that sometimes they need a lot of help to tell their stories, I feel. To try to grapple with them, to gain their voices, to put it in a way that makes sense. And I also saw something in that memoir that was a very kind of accurate account of his time in Camp 15, Yodok. It was very void of emotion. And in the testimonials of defectors that I have read, either people can be very emotional and their story's quite jangled, out of chronology, out of causality, distancing techniques through changing perspectives, point of views, passive voice, or they can tell their story very accurately start to finish, and there's something very emotional missing. Because a story is a meaning-making device, and to put it all together, the heart and the events together, can make a story that can probably overwhelm you. And we all know that when we tell a painful story, we relive the pain, right? If something bad happens to you and you speak it, you start to weep. Imagine a story that might have the power to incapacitate you if you talk about separation from loved ones, leaving a community that you'll never be back with again. And one of the things I noticed right away is that people who have really painful stories to tell, whether it's in Rwanda, I've studied a lot of narratives around the world, right here in America, people need help. And that's one of the things I teach my students is that, if you know how to tell a story, you kind of have a duty to help others tell theirs if for whatever reason they can't find their voice. I read The Aquariums of Pyongyang, and I was pretty shocked to realize that though I thought of myself as an educated, informed person, I knew nothing about this place on the other side of the world. I didn't know the history of the peninsula. I didn't know that gulags were up and functioning. David Hawkes' The Hidden Gulag was just online, his first edition. I went and read that. I downloaded that and devoured it. I read Bradley K. Martin's Under the Loving Care of the Fatherly Leader was just out, A History of the Kim Regime. And I started to read more books just out of fascination. But one thing was missing, and it was just the stories of normal people. The narratives of defectors out of the gulags were quite extreme examples. The Kim regime is crazy and absurd, that history. And there were a lot of books on economics, geopolitics, the nuclear military dimension. But what was it like to just be a normal person? That's something I had a hard time finding. A lot of narratives would come online through the 2000s. Now I think it's fairly easy to read the stories of normal people. But I just read voraciously as a curious reader for a year. And as a writer, those voices just started to come out. I started finding myself doodling sketches, writing portraits, playing with voices. That's how my mind processes things. Why did I write about a novel about North Korea? I'm a novelist, and that's what I do. Whether you're a humanitarian or an editor or a journalist, that's the skill set that you have. Once I started reading propaganda, and I started going to the kcna.jp every morning, which seemed absurd to me then. Now I read it every morning. I'm like, oh yeah, of course. It all makes sense. But it was all a mystery to me then. I really, after a year, suddenly realized that I was engaged in something. And another interesting thing is that I wrote this all from here, at Palo Alto, and in San Francisco, at Stanford. I didn't go, to the Tumen River or the Yalu River. I didn't go to Hanawon. I've got 3 kids. I've got a job. I've got students. But I think the book was possible because of a lot of this work that began coming online. I think that if I had, during that first year, read Barbara's book, I might not have written mine. I think she answered the question that I was striving to get at. Or if I'd have spent a dinner with Kathy, I think I would have got what I needed. But for a fiction writer, something half seen fires the imagination to complete the rest. And even when I went to Pyongyang and I was amongst real people with normal stories to tell that were quite different than mine that I wanted to know, I knew we had a united humanity, though the particulars of our lives were so different. But I was not allowed to talk to them. I was allowed to walk amongst them. I almost spoke to one woman by the Taedong River, and we met eye contact. Even just stopping and appraising me might have cast her under a light of suspicion. I don't know. But those minders separated us right away. There was no way I was going to talk to this average citizen. And I just knew I had to work this woman into the novel. I had to find out who she was, even if I had to make it up. So I will say that I think North Korea is one place, let me check my timer, is one place where the long reach of literary fiction might be especially applicable. One, it's difficult to confirm anything in the journalistic world about what happens in North Korea. The only thing that makes it out are human stories, and they can't be confirmed or verified. That's why even if you're a great journalist or a great long-form nonfiction writer, you're up against a great challenge. But for fiction, these things you can't use in journalism, legend, rumor, story, those are whispers, suggestions. Those are all equally valid in my realm. Those can all be used to conjure a portrait. And those are off limits for everyone else. And I'll say that literary fiction is also dedicated at modeling the lives of other humans via characters in a way that allows us to transcend our own experience and go to the experiences of others. Fiction can cross through space and time and across boundaries of all sorts. And I think 2 of the big traps of our existence is that we don't know what's going to happen next. None of us knows. And of course, literary fiction harnesses that page-turning power, doesn't it? It's an illusion that you don't know what's going to happen next in the story. Of course, it's all complete and constructed for you. The sense that there is a meaningful resolution, though you don't know it yet as you engage a text, is very powerful. And the other thing about humanity is that we will never see inside the mind of another person, no matter what. We'll never know what another person is thinking. We just have to trust that that person loves us, or that they're loyal to us, or that we share a common experience. But literary fiction is the one art dedicated going into directly the perspectives and minds of other people. And these are the two big questions everyone asks about North Korea. What's going to happen next, and what are they thinking? And we have an art form dedicated to it. You know, when I told people here at Stanford I was writing a novel about North Korea, they were like, "You're crazy. You've got to get tenure. You're crazy." But the more I read the stories of people there, the more I was forced to engage my own stories. You know, what would I do if I was born there? What if I have three young children? What would our lives be like? What if I had to make some of the tough decisions they made? I walked around in lovely Palo Alto with our perfect weather, wondering what I would do if there was only enough food to feed 2 kids that day. For like a year, that's my timer. For, you know, a year especially, my wife didn't like it. I was very down. I just kind of walked around trying to figure out, how would we retain our humanity? How would we keep our family together? You know, how would we find hope and possibility? And we know that everyone in North Korea feels the exact same things we do. They have the same aspirations. They want safety, security, fulfillment. They want better lives for their children. But the constraints are much different, and the possibilities are much different. And the only way that I could know that then was to make it up by projecting myself there and doing a lot of research. So, okay, thank you so much.
The last one is always to be the hardest one, but I'll try. How does the international media cover North Korea? First of all, I'd like to congratulate Barbara for receiving the 2012 Journalism Award for her book, Nothing to Envy. A very compassionate account. I recommend to everyone because it depicts ordinary North Korean people, highlighting their difficulties, their sufferings, their dreams and hopes, all of which is deeply moving. Media is, of course, a powerful source of social influence, and it is therefore important to provide as complete as a picture possible. For instance, what do we see in our minds when we hear North Korea? Chances are the answers point to missiles, hungry children, military parades, goose-stepping soldiers, political posters, or photos of Kim Jong-un on covers of Western magazines. But this is only one reality of North Korea. Allow me to give you some additional food for thought, garnered from my 5 years living and working in Pyongyang, and particularly from my most recent visit to North Korea last October. What do I see? An office worker chatting on his mobile phone. A secretary walking around with high-heeled shoes. Youngsters rollerblading in Kim Il-sung Square or in front of the Korea Hotel. School children learning English in a classroom. A farmer walking along an ox. Hundreds of people busily doing harvesting. It was rice harvest time. There are different realities in this country whose people are facing a magnitude of problems, starting, as Barbara pointed out, from food deprivation or chronic malnutrition for many. But, like anywhere else in the world, people are people who cry and despair, but also smile and hope. Clearly, reporting on North Korea is not an easy task. In fact, it is an obstacle-ridden one. How do journalists gather information when access is the biggest issue? How do analysts provide an accurate, multifaceted point of view? What are the sources available? Here are some points that we should acknowledge. Reporters can occasionally make a trip to North Korea, so their findings are shared. Moreover, a few news agencies have opened offices in Pyongyang, and I hope more will do so. Foreigners residing in Pyongyang, for example, diplomats, aid workers, or UN employees, are often asked for information. Usually, the few business people on the ground prefer not to comment. Then I also noted that tourists are increasing in number. They provide their views and experiences, and I do think it is a good idea to have a look, especially if one wishes to report on North Korea. Of course, opportunities do not abound, but tourists are welcome. They are consigned to certain areas, always what I would call cared for by the authorities, but they are still able to look, to listen, to see, and to hear if they are really attentive. Then we have aid workers, activists, Koreans living in China, religious groups, working in the Chinese border area, assisting defectors. They all provide information to the press. South Korea is where the largest proportion of news about North Korea emerges. The South Korean media, however, has a strong political spin, whether to the right or to the left. Reports that don't fit their orientation are often ignored, or certain kinds of stories are pushed forward. Information can be accurate, but should be treated with caution. Then we have Seoul or US-based websites. These are again often run by activist groups, and some have a clearly political agenda. And gathering news is not their main task. Therefore, the line can be blurred. And we also need to take into account their anti-North Korean bias. So they often have very valuable information. They tend to offer much more in a way of bad news than good news. Also, there aren't that many good news from North Korea, I must admit. And then the defectors that have found their way to Seoul. They are, however, a tiny group and do not represent mainstream. They are interviewed over and over again. Some even earn a living by speaking to the press. And some are connected to activist groups. And some, so one journalist admitted to me, know how to say what journalists want to hear. Therefore, information really needs to be carefully read. And we need to be aware of the possible pitfalls. Moreover, it can take 2 or 3 years from when a defector leaves North Korea until he or she reaches the South. So the information they provide can also be quite out of date because the situation is changing. Another issue are regional differences. Overall, the situation on North Korea's east coast is very different from the provinces around Pyongyang, let alone the capital itself. And most defectors are from North Hamgyong province. And North Hamgyong province has about 10% of the overall population. North Hamgyong is also one of the poorest and least developed areas of the whole country. The region registers the highest level of food insecurity and has suffered the most during the famine. And then there is also a history of bad feelings between Pyongyang and North Hamgyong. This all colors the defectors' accounts, which remain valid, but are not always representative of the situation in other parts of the country, for the better or the worse. Then the other problem is verification. Are the reports true or false or fabricated, exaggerated or distorted? I noted that sometimes an article appears in different newspapers. If one compares, one soon realizes that the information is adapted according to the style of each publication, and that in the spirit of Chinese whispers, a somewhat further distorted picture emerges. This is all problematic, not least because it ensures that issues are blown out of proportion and generate what is commonly called a media hype, rather than constructive knowledge building. At one time, I want to give you an example. During my Pyongyang years, the international media reported that the markets had been closed and my phone was ringing non-stop. Interesting, so off I went to the biggest market in Pyongyang, and our cook went to a small district market where she went basically every other day. What was the situation? Yes, the markets were closed, but they also opened every day from 5 to 7 o'clock in the evening. The closure was not a repressive one, as much as a necessity, because most of the people were out in the countryside rice planting. So this is just one simple example, but this happened all the time. My feeling is that there is still very little known about mainstream North Korean society. We need reporting that amplifies the voice of the North Korean people too. They deserve attention at the international level. If public perception shifts away from politics and regime leadership, it also means support to ordinary people, gradually strengthening their capacity to bring about change inside their own country. Most books, Escape from Camp 14, The Aquariums of Pyongyang, Escaping from North Korea, to name a few examples, are written by defectors, often people that spent years in the horrible prison camps. The 24 million ordinary North Koreans who live average lives and who are struggling day by day to make ends meet or to simply lead a decent life tend to go forgotten or are left ignored. And also because we do have certain expectations about North Korea, we quite like to read about prison camps, but not about anything every day or perhaps even anything the North Koreans do right. I feel there is a certain bias in the Western media about North Korea, and at times North Korea even becomes a source of fun. And this country is no fun, and it is nothing to laugh about. My North Korean staff could not grasp the meaning of the caricatures about their leadership in the Western press. What did it do? They felt frightened or scared, or at times simply disgusted about the West. During my years in Pyongyang, journalists would often contact me to get or verify information. I could, of course, not comment on all issues, often because I also did not have the full picture or knew the reality. But where I had something to say, I did so because I felt it was an obligation and part of my job. It was, however, important for me to build up relationships with the press, because trust was and is crucial. And if I said off the record, it really had to be off the record, not for my sake, but for the sake of the person I was talking about. To me, what could happen was that I would have been expelled, but that would have been the situation, nothing that serious. I must also say, luckily, many journalists covering North Korea are based in Beijing, so it was not too difficult to meet and speak there. In closing, I would like to quote Cho San-hung, a journalist for the New York Times, who I happened to meet last year at the conference. And he said something which really stuck with me. He said that because people read about the extraordinary aspects, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. And this is the case in terms of North Korea. Indeed, there are many issues and problems, and all media coverage has to be treated with careful thought. Nobody has the full picture. But personally, I hope that there will be more efforts to give North Korean people the attention they deserve, so that public perception becomes more balanced. Nothing to envy. Barbara's book is one of the very few that is about ordinary people. It, however, provides a snapshot of the late 1990s, the latter part of the famine years. And what do I hope? I do hope Barbara will write another book about the situation, because it has changed and we have moved forward. Once again, congratulations, Barbara. I treasure the work you do on North Korea and for its people. Thank you.
Well, I think this panel has fulfilled its mission gloriously of giving you very different perspectives on covering North Korea. And now you have an opportunity. We have about a little more than 20 minutes to ask questions. Again, please identify yourselves. And if you have a specific person you're asking the question to, please say who that is. Otherwise, we'll leave it open to people to respond. Go ahead. And there's a microphone there. So.
I'm Melissa Chan formerly with Al Jazeera English in China. I guess my question is for Barbara. In your book, I'm not trying to ruin the ending, but it's so palpable how difficult the transition is for North Korean defectors in South Korea. I'm a little curious. Two questions. One is long term. What do you think will happen if, the North has to somehow, the society changes and it has to somehow integrate or, unify, right? There's unification ministry. Like that adjustment seems to me like huge, 24 million people, and just the few people in your book are struggling. And so I wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. And also I was fascinated because it seemed like the older women were the ones who seemed to adjust the best. Why do you think that is? And the men were the ones who were really, really struggling in South Korea.
Am I on? I'll answer the second question first. I think the older North Koreans have had an easier time adjusting to South Korea because essentially they're the same people. Somebody who was born in the 1940s, whether it was in South Korea or North Korea, essentially grew up with the same songs, the same education, the same diet. They're the same size. They have the same, social values. And so they're really the same people. The problem is often for the younger generation, especially people who came of age during the famine years. North Koreans are much smaller than South Koreans. The figure in my book, which is actually a figure for South Koreans versus North Korean defectors, is 5 inches for an 18-year-old boy. That's a big height difference. And their education is totally different. They've been steeped in the North Korean propaganda. Male, female, it's a bigger deal if you're small. When you're a man, there's a lot of ideas about North Korean women. There's a whole thing in Korea. Namnam Bukyo is like the ideal combination as a South Korean man and a North Korean woman. I mean, I think that has to do with power dynamics. I mean, I saw that living in Germany in the 90s too, is West German guys like to date East German women because you could impress an East German woman with a VW. You didn't need a BMW. So it's the same. It's very, very similar. In terms of reunification, I mean, you're right. The few thousand North Koreans who are living in South Korea now, it's like a dress rehearsal for what could be, something very big if it collapses. I would crib this answer from Andrei Lankov, who's a Russian scholar who lives in Seoul, and I mean, he gave a whole conference about this a few years ago when it looked like North Korea really would collapse. And the thinking was that they would probably have to be separate for a good 10, 20 years. There would never be a German-style reunification because the income difference between North and South is roughly 20 times what it was between the Germanys. And if you just put them together, all the North Koreans would take the South Korean jobs. All the South Koreans would buy up all the real estate in Pyongyang and drive up the prices. They would have to be probably kept separate for a long time.
My name is Harry Bang, a retired teacher, a Korean American. I would like to address Ms. Catherine. Would you inform us about Kim Jong-un, the young Korean leader's educational record in Swiss while he was studying?
Yes.
It's a question I have been asked many, many times. Let me say, Switzerland and North Korea have had diplomatic relations for almost 40 years. Next year it's 40 years, so there have always been, Switzerland forms diplomatic relation with every country that wants to have relations with Switzerland. And the relations have been okay. There have always been quite a number of family members in Switzerland. However, if they were high-ranking ones, they were not there under their real names. So the Swiss government did not know who was there at the time. And that was the situation also for the Kim brothers, let me put it that way. So I can give you not more than what I also read in the press, because the Swiss government does not really know that much more.
Okay, I don't believe that, but that's okay. I hope the Swiss government knows more than that. Yes.
Bob Martyr is my name. I'm a retired judge in San Francisco. The question I have is for both Barbara and Susan, and that is, as North Korea becomes less hermetically sealed, with the people going to China, North Koreans going somewhat freely to China to work, to make money, to come back into North Korea, and also the increase in North Korean students studying abroad in countries where they learn technology and also English language skills and are exposed to democracy and obviously much higher standards of living. What effect will that have on the North Korean regime in terms of creating a class that's dissenting from the rule that has been so pervasive, and will that lead to an underground movement, as we saw in Eastern Europe, which will become recognizable, let's say, in the next couple of years?
Barbara, well, I'll try. I mean, the truth is, what I could say is that I have no idea, and I'm being quite honest. My own access, Barbara, I defer to because she's more directly involved. I think one of the difficult challenges, Adam, I thought, was very eloquent in the idea of, you know, as a novelist, but also as a journalist, you try to understand what are people thinking. And I think one of the perils of foreign correspondence that isn't culturally informed and historically informed is that you tend to think that people would do what you as an American would do, or act as you an American would act. Surely they're desperate to rise up. Surely they just can't wait, you know, for the proper moment before overthrowing the tyranny. And I don't really know. I mean, obviously there's an undercurrent of disaffection, starvation, and so on. But this is just my guess, and I'd love to hear Barbara's. I think it's very hard for us to imagine how, at least from my understanding, how pervasive the propaganda is and how much people are cut off from alternate sources of information that might allow them to have a better comparative sense. I mean, obviously people are not fools and they see the inequities and the corruption and the problems, but it's very difficult for me to handicap this from the outside, and I feel that as a journalist, we often err about predictions. We're not very good prognosticators. But Barbara.
You're right. This is one of the questions I most often asked is, why when people come to China don't they stay? You know, how do they go back to North Korea? You know, it's very interesting. The people I talked to recently in October who were coming over to work in China often came over on legal crossing documents. There's sort of a loophole where if you have relatives in China, you can come over to work for a few months. Well, you can come over to visit, but you work. But when they're given those permissions, they're told, don't talk when you get back. Don't tell people what you've seen. But it is a big issue because people come back and they say, oh my God, in China, they eat rice every day. They eat rice 3 times a day. And that has been something that really has corroded the reputation of the North Korean regime. And this story is some years back, but I met a family in Seoul, and the parents were with a trading company, and they used to go back and forth pretty often. And they said that when they came back to North Korea, they never told their children about what they saw in China. You know, not because they didn't trust their children, but they wanted their children to be able to fit into mainstream North Korean society. So they preferred that they didn't know. And, you know, actually I've heard North Koreans say that in China. I'm going to go back and I'm going to live a normal life and I'm going to forget that I was ever here.
But, you know, I'll just say one more thing, and then I know Orville. I'm always astounded. I was in South Korea along with Dan in the late 80s when the South Koreans really rose up against a pretty appalling dictatorial regime. And it is interesting, you never do know when that moment comes. And I'm not suggesting it's about to come, but if, you know, having been in North Korea pardon me, in South Korea in the months leading up to that movement, it was not obvious to me, nor to anyone else.
Can you wait for the microphone?
Orville Shell from the Asia Society. Susan, if that moment isn't the way the worm finally turns, but more a slow evolutionary glide path, the most logical glide path is, of course, the Chinese model. And I think this is what the Chinese are really pushing. In other words, open up your markets, get some special economic zones, et cetera. And yet they've had, things like the Rajan Songbon zone for 20 years and nothing much has come of it. How do you all assess the prospect for this society to maybe go that route? There still seems to be so much resistance to it.
Kathy, you want to?
Yeah, I think you would.
Well, having lived there for 5 years and having been or started going to North Korea in the mid-90s, not 50s, by the way, Dan, as you
I said
pointed
mid-1990s.
When I'm asked about changes, I call them the 5 M's I observed, and that is money is now playing a much bigger role than in the mid-90s. It's the topic of daily conversations. Then markets are just so essential to survive. Mobile telephones, the dream of every Korean, and we now have, I think, 1.5 million mobiles, and it's going up quite rapidly. Then we have more motor cars, my 4th M, and my 5th M is a small middle class developing in North Korea, especially in Pyongyang and also in some bigger cities. And that is really visible. And the people basically, what do they want is a better life. They still like their country, it's home, but their living conditions, they would prefer to see differently. And I think with these steps, you see that things are happening. For example, during my years there, we sent every year about 80 to 100 young North Koreans abroad for training programs, anything from a few weeks to 1 academic year. And as you just said, they may not talk about it immediately, but when you work with these people, you see it has an impact and their thinking is changing. So I think it's a slow process. And personally, I'm quite happy if it is a slow process, because I think nobody, neither the North nor the South, could cope with a fast unification.
The change is amazing. I mean, when you talk to people, you always have to find out what year they were there or what year they left.
Absolutely.
I remember I went there in 2007. I went for just one trip 5 years ago. And, I asked my minders, I said, there are cell phone towers there, but where are the cell phones? Because I didn't see a single person use one. And she said, oh, those are not cell phone towers. And I said, I'm from California. I know what a tree disguised or a cell phone tower disguised as a tree looks like. And in December, I was in Japan interviewing someone who had left, and his phone rang. He says, oh, that's my wife in Pyongyang. I've got to take it. And I said, she called you from Pyongyang? He said, yeah, but I can't call her back. But it will happen. I mean, it's unbelievable to me, the amount of change taking place.
Over there.
Hello, my name is Lisa Min. I'm a graduate student in anthropology at Berkeley. I'm really glad to be here and to have been able to listen to your talk. So one thing I noticed, and this happens all the time, especially in the field of journalism, is like the stress on verisimilitude. Obviously, it's kind of the name of the game with journalism. Verisimilitude, objectivity. And I do find those to be very important things to consider, but I also wonder what possibilities there are in kind of lingering in things that are considered untrue or stilted or influenced by time or media or the society. And this is probably me coming from a somewhat postmodern anthropological perspective, but I guess I'd like to hear your comments on Like when doing interviews and people are telling stories that seem false or made up, what could we learn from digging deeper into those kinds of lines of inquiry?
I was going to say Adam.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm into truth. What can I say? I love Adam's writing, but it's fiction, and he I think captured the psyche in a way that you can't with nonfiction, and I loved his book, but I'm into nonfiction. I mean, one of the things I've tried to do reporting in North Korea especially, but also in China, is to do repeat interviews with people. In my North Korea book, all those people I knew for several years and interviewed 10 plus times. And a first interview is kind of like a first date. You hear a very set narrative somebody has of their life, and the whole story unfolds with time. And for example, I don't know who here has read my book, but there's an older woman in the book whose son has died of starvation, and I knew her for about 2 years before she told me that her son died and how her son died. She could never talk about it. In fact, I heard about her son's death from somebody else, and then I went back to her. So I would say, yeah, if you want to get into people's lives, you have to do repeat interviews, and you have to challenge them, and you have to cross-examine them. One thing I often do in interviews to get people not to exaggerate is I say, don't exaggerate. It's sort of saying, like, get people to keep out. You say, don't go here. But I explain what I'm doing, and I say, try to, tell me just what you saw and what you heard, not what somebody else did. And, they may think that I have some other source of information, but, I'll give them a little spiel about this, you don't have to embellish the story, because sometimes, and this is not, this is true of anybody, this was really true in the Balkans. I did an earlier book about Bosnia. If a journalist has come from far away to talk to them, they feel like they owe you a good story. It has nothing to do with paying them. They want to, but you say, keep it exactly as it was.
So let me just offer any of you any final thoughts you might have before we close up. Well, I guess we can do one more. Let's do a quick question.
Hi, my name is Diana. I'm a postdoc fellow here at Shorenstein Stanford. I had a question for Barbara. I'm really curious about the differences in reporting at large in China versus North Korea, because although obviously the level of censorship is really different, it wasn't that long ago that China looked more like Korea. And in fact, when I speak to my parents about North Korea, they don't have the same level of fascination as I do, because they said, oh, well, we lived it, a couple of decades ago. So could you talk about that?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's, it is very similar, and I think, for me, when I wrote my book about North Korea, I had not covered China, and maybe I would have been less fascinated had I already been a Beijing correspondent. The way I, explain it to people who are Chinese is, it's like the Great Leap Forward never ended and the Cultural Revolution never ended. They're still both going on. I know quite a few Chinese who've been to North Korea, and it's interesting their perspectives, because they do it almost like a nostalgia tour. There's this whole, I don't get it, the socialist nostalgia business, but they go and, they see the propaganda posters, and it's like, oh, it's just like old times. And one of the news assistants in my office went on a North Korea trip, and she took pictures of the toilet paper, which was, brown and crinkly, and her parents just thought it was hysterical, that she was so amazed by it, because that's old China.
Well, that sort of exhausts our time, and ending on toilet paper seems to be entirely appropriate. One thing I'd like to say just before making a couple closing remark was that we have a we're having a conference on Friday to talk about policy towards North Korea, most of which is a closed session, but we will have a public event with Ambassador Stephen Bosworth, who was the American Special Envoy for North Korea during most of the first term of the Obama administration, and that'll be a lunchtime event, I believe, in this room. Yes, in this room. So I encourage you, if you are interested in this, I encourage you to join us for that. So I just want to thank everybody here, and I'm always amazed at how much I learn from events like this and from this group of people here. I think we learned a tremendous amount, so I think we're lucky to have had everybody here. And again, this is part of a special day of congratulating Barbara on her tremendous body of work, not only on North Korea, but her whole career as a journalist, and that we will be doing this evening. But I'm glad we got this chance to give you a little taste of why we chose Barbara. So thank you very much, everybody.